Attention! This channel provides original historical analysis based on sources and research. We do not simply recount events, we analyze their causes and consequences, explaining them through original narration, editing, and visual diagrams. A list of sources is included in the description. Enjoy watching. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are telling the story of a real event that took place on January 24, 1945, in northeastern France. A decision made by one man in the space of a few seconds that determined the fate of hundreds of soldiers on both sides of the front line. This is not a story built from legend or myth. Every detail comes from military records, eyewitness accounts, and official citation documents. Stay with us. January 24, 1945, Alsace, France. The temperature is -10 degrees Celsius. 600 German soldiers and 6 Tiger tanks are moving through frozen forest toward a single American battalion. The forward observation post has been destroyed. The artillery observers are dead. Without someone who can see the German advance and direct American guns onto it, the battalion will be overrun within minutes. One man picks up a telephone and 400 yards of wire. He does not ask for permission. He does not wait for orders. He walks out of the command post into the snow, alone, toward 600 enemy soldiers. And what he does in the next 3 hours will not be officially recognized for 73 years. By January 1945, the Allied campaign in Western Europe had moved far beyond the beaches of Normandy. In 7 months, American, British, Canadian, and French forces had liberated most of France and Belgium, crossed into the Netherlands, and pushed to the western border of Germany itself. The momentum was real. But the front line was not a clean, advancing wave. In Alsace, in the far northeastern corner of France, along the eastern bank of the Rhine River, a significant section of German-held territory had remained in place since November 1944, resisting every attempt to dislodge it. This territory had a name among the Allied commanders, the Colmar Pocket. It occupied approximately 850 square miles of frozen forest, agricultural land, and river valley terrain west of the Rhine. The Germans had established strong defensive positions across this area in late autumn 1944, and the French First Army, supported by American units, including divisions of General Jacob Devers' 6th Army Group, had made multiple attempts to eliminate the pocket before Christmas. Each attempt had failed. The terrain was dense and difficult. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was one of the most severe in European recorded history, with temperatures in Alsace dropping as low as -20 degrees Celsius during the coldest nights. The frozen ground, the bare tree lines, and the early darkness gave every tactical advantage to the defending force. The unit holding the pocket was the German 19th Army, commanded by General Baptist Knies. These were not the fresh, well-supplied divisions that had crossed into France in 1940. By January 1945, the 19th Army consisted largely of veterans who had retreated northward through southern France after the Allied landings in Provence in August 1944. They had lost significant equipment and personnel during that retreat. Fuel was scarce. Replacements were inadequate. Communication lines were under constant Allied air attack. But the men who remained were experienced soldiers who understood defensive tactics, who knew how to use terrain, and who understood that the Rhine River directly behind them offered no refuge. To retreat across it would be to abandon the last German-held territory on French soil. The orders from Berlin were unambiguous: hold the pocket. 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, held a section of the northern perimeter of the Colmar Pocket near the village of Husson, approximately 5 kilometers northeast of Colmar itself. The 3rd Infantry Division was among the most combat-experienced American divisions in the European theater. It had fought in North Africa in 1943, participated in the amphibious landings in Sicily and at Anzio, advanced through Italy, and landed in southern France in August 1944. By January 1945, The division's soldiers were no strangers to sustained combat in difficult conditions, but the Alsace winter tested even veteran units severely. 3rd Battalion had been on the line for 18 consecutive days without rotation. The temperature averaged -10 degrees Celsius during daylight hours and dropped significantly lower at night. There was no moonlight during this period, which meant that the front line existed in near total darkness after sunset, broken only by flares fired by both sides to illuminate potential approach routes. Snow covered every surface, making movement both visible and noisy. A man walking through frozen snow crust could be heard at 50 yards on a still night. The soldiers of 3rd Battalion lived in positions they had dug, or attempted to dig, into ground that was frozen solid to a depth of 2 to 3 feet. Genuine foxholes required pickaxes and several hours of physical labor. Most positions were shallow scrapes that provided concealment but limited protection against anything heavier than small arms fire. Artillery rounds detonating in frozen earth produced lethal fragments that traveled further and faster than shells bursting in soft soil. Men slept in short intervals when the bombardments paused, wearing every piece of clothing they possessed, and ate cold rations because open fires were visible to German observers. In 18 days, the battalion had lost 43 men, killed and wounded, primarily to German artillery and to the precision fire of snipers who had studied the battalion's positions from prepared observation posts on higher ground. Among the battalion's officers was 1st Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor. His official role was Battalion Intelligence Officer, a staff position that existed entirely behind the front line. Intelligence officers gathered information. They interrogated prisoners taken during night patrols, compiled reports on German unit positions and movements, analyzed the pattern of enemy activity to identify preparation for attacks, and maintained the tactical maps that the battalion commander used to make decisions. It was work done at a desk, with paper and maps and a telephone. It was not work that placed an officer in direct contact with the enemy. Connor was 25 years old. He had grown up on a tobacco farm in Clinton County, Kentucky, in a part of the country where the terrain was steep, the soil was thin, and farming required sustained physical effort for modest returns. The nearest school to the Connor family farm was 15 miles away, a distance that, on unpaved roads in rural Kentucky in the 1930s, made regular attendance practically impossible. Connor had not completed secondary school. He had enlisted in the United States Army in March 1941, motivated by the widening war in Europe and the Pacific, 9 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor formalized American entry into the conflict. His record across 4 years of service was not the record of a staff officer. Connor had participated in 10 major campaigns across North Africa, Italy, southern France, and Alsace. He had made 4 amphibious assault landings under fire, operations that placed soldiers in open boats approaching defended beaches, among the most dangerous military undertakings of the war. He had been wounded 7 times. Each wound had sent him to a field hospital, and each time he had returned to the same battalion. The most recent wound had been received in early January 1945. He had returned to 3rd Battalion 2 days before January 24th, with that wound still not fully closed. 4 Silver Stars were attached to his service record. The Silver Star is awarded for gallantry in action against an opposing military force, not for performing one's assigned duties under difficult conditions, but for voluntary action that goes beyond what the situation required, involving direct personal risk. Each of Connor's Silver Stars corresponded to a specific documented incident. October 1943 in Italy, January 1944 at Anzio, September 1944 during operations in southern France. Each citation described a moment when the tactical situation had become desperate, and Connor had moved toward it rather than away from it. The men of 3rd Battalion understood this pattern. It was simply what Connor did when the situation required it. On the night of January 23, 1945, German patrol activity along the battalion's perimeter increased noticeably. Multiple probing actions tested different sections of the line. Connor reviewed the patrol reports as they came in through the night. The pattern was familiar to anyone who had studied German pre-attack doctrine. Aggressive reconnaissance, testing defensive strength and identifying gaps, conducted in the hours before a major operation. Connor marked the most likely German approach routes on his map. By dawn on January 24th, he had a clear picture of where the pressure would come from. He could not have known precisely what was coming, but he was not surprised when, at exactly 7 o'clock, the German artillery opened fire. Write in the comments what city you are from and subscribe to the channel. That is the best support you can give us, and we move on. The barrage lasted exactly 12 minutes. German 105mm and 150mm howitzers fired in a coordinated pattern, walking shells systematically across the battalion's forward positions from left to right and back again, a technique designed not simply to kill, but to suppress, to pin every defender flat against the ground and prevent any organized response during the critical minutes that followed. The shells targeted the tree line first, then the known foxhole positions, then the communication trenches and telephone lines running between the forward positions and the command post. Trees along the perimeter exploded from direct hits, sending jagged wooden fragments horizontally across the snow. Frozen earth fountained upward in dark columns and fell back as gravel. The concussion waves from 150mm shells were powerful enough to rupture eardrums at a range of 30 yards, and soldiers in the forward positions who survived the impacts did so by pressing themselves against the frozen floor of their positions and waiting. At 7:12, the barrage stopped. The silence that followed was not ordinary. Veterans of extended combat developed an instinct for distinguishing between different kinds of silence. The pause between salvos while gun crews reloaded, the longer break while observers corrected fire, and the particular stillness that meant the artillery phase of an operation had concluded because the next phase was already in motion. This was the third kind. Experienced soldiers in the forward foxholes felt it before they consciously understood it. A preparation barrage did not end because the guns had run out of ammunition. It ended because the infantry was in position and ready to advance. At 7:15, a runner arrived at the battalion command post. He had covered the distance from the forward positions in under 2 minutes, moving at a run through terrain that German shells had just finished hitting. His report required only a few sentences. German infantry was advancing on the battalion's left flank, moving through the forest in significant numbers. Not a patrol, not a probing action, but a full assault formation moving with purpose. Behind the infantry, the runner had heard engines, heavy engines, multiple vehicles, the unmistakable mechanical grind of tracked armor moving through frozen ground. Before being ordered back, he had counted 6 large silhouettes moving through the tree line. 6 tanks. The battalion commander assessed the situation against the map in front of him. The left flank terrain consisted of a section of dense forest, approximately 400 yards from the command post, separated from the American defensive line by open ground. The tree line provided the German armor with cover during the approach, but once the tanks broke into the open, they would have approximately 300 yards of clear ground before reaching the American foxholes. 300 yards for a Tiger tank moving at its operational speed of less than 20 miles per hour meant less than 2 minutes of exposure. The battalion had no tanks of its own in position. The 3rd Infantry Division's tank destroyer assets, M10 Wolverines, equipped with 76mm guns capable of engaging Tigers at close range, were not positioned close enough to respond in time. The Sherman tanks allocated to divisional support were committed to other sectors of the perimeter. The calculation was straightforward. The only weapon system available that could stop 6 Tiger tanks, or at minimum slow and disrupt their advance sufficiently to prevent the battalion line from being overrun, was the artillery battery positioned 3 miles behind the front. 12 105mm M2A1 howitzers, capable of delivering sustained, high-volume fire onto a target area. Against infantry in the open, 105mm high-explosive rounds were devastating. The lethal fragment radius of a single shell extended approximately 50 yards in all directions. Against Tiger tanks directly, the 105mm shell could not penetrate frontal armor rated at 100mm thickness, but concentrated fire could destroy tracks, shatter optics, damage the engine deck, and force tank commanders to button up their hatches, significantly reducing their situational awareness. 12 guns firing simultaneously could, under the right conditions, stop an armored advance, or at minimum degrade it enough to give the infantry defenders a fighting chance. But artillery without a forward observer was nearly useless. The Fire Direction Center 3 miles to the rear could not see the battlefield. Without someone at the front who could observe where the shells were landing relative to the targets and transmit corrections, the guns would fire based on map coordinates alone, a process that in broken forest terrain, with advancing troops moving constantly, produced results that were as likely to miss completely as to hit. The forward observation post that had been established specifically for this purpose, a reinforced position approximately 200 yards ahead of the American line, with a direct telephone connection to the Fire Direction Center, had been destroyed during the German barrage. Both observers assigned to that post were dead. No other observation assets existed with a line of sight to the German approach route. From the command post itself, the intervening forest blocked any view of what was advancing. Connor was standing at the map table. He had been there since the barrage began, tracking what he could hear against the terrain features marked on his map. When the runner's report came in, he already knew the approach route. He had identified it the previous night from the patrol reports. He understood the ground. He understood the distance. He understood precisely what it meant that no forward observer was in position. He did not deliberate visibly. He did not present the battalion commander with options or request guidance. He picked up the field telephone, a standard EE-8 field set, and a spool containing 400 yards of WD-1 communication wire. He looked at the battalion commander for a moment. Then he walked out of the command post into the snow. The German guns had gone quiet, but Connor knew from experience that the silence was temporary. Standard German attack doctrine called for a second artillery preparation timed to coincide with the moment the assault infantry closed to within effective range of the American defensive positions. The barrage would resume to pin down the defenders precisely when the attacking troops needed suppression most. Based on the runner's report and the distance involved, Connor estimated he had 3 to 4 minutes before the guns opened again. He ran. The 400 yards of open ground between the command post and the forward foxholes was flat, completely exposed, and covered with a crust of frozen snow that broke under each footfall, slowing movement and making each step audible in the morning quiet. The wire spool unrolled behind him as he moved, paying out across the snow. At 100 yards, the German guns opened fire. Not a preparation barrage this time, but targeted, observed fire. German observers positioned with the advancing force had spotted a lone American soldier crossing open ground directly toward them and were adjusting artillery onto a moving single target. Shells landed 40 yards to his left, then 30 yards to his right. The classic bracketing sequence used to walk rounds onto a target. Connor kept moving. A shell hit a tree 70 yards ahead and detonated, showering the snow with frozen wooden fragments. He ran through the debris without breaking stride. At 250 yards, a shell split a large tree directly in his path, dropping half the trunk across the snow. He vaulted it. Another round landed 20 yards behind him. The concussion wave traveled through the frozen ground and caught him, and he stumbled forward but did not fall. He crossed the American front line at approximately 300 yards. Soldiers in foxholes on both sides of his path stared at him. A staff officer, an intelligence man, running forward with a telephone toward an enemy assault. He did not stop to explain. 30 yards beyond the American line, he found a shallow drainage ditch, 18 inches deep, running perpendicular to the German line of advance. 18 inches was not enough to stop a rifle bullet. It was not enough to stop artillery shrapnel. It was barely enough to keep his silhouette below the surface of the snow when he lay flat. But it gave him a sight line directly toward the German tree line, and it was the only cover available within reach. He dropped into the ditch. The wire behind him had held throughout the run intact, still connected to the command post. He cranked the handset. The line buzzed. Then a voice answered from the Fire Direction Center 3 miles away. Connor had reached his position. The Germans were 200 yards out and advancing. What happened next would last 3 hours. The voice that came through the handset was calm and professional. The Artillery Fire Direction Center, 3 miles behind the front line, had been waiting for exactly this kind of call. Connor identified himself, gave his position coordinates, and reported the situation in the precise language of military fire control. Enemy infantry advancing in company strength, 6 Tiger tanks moving in support, no other American observers in position. He would direct fire from his current location. The fire direction officer confirmed the connection and repeated the coordinates back to him. 12 100 5mm M2A1 howitzers were loaded and ready. The guns had ammunition for sustained fire. Connor was now the sole link between those 12 guns and everything advancing toward the American line. He raised his head above the ditch rim and assessed the situation. The German infantry were approximately 200 yards away, moving through the trees in textbook squad formations. One squad advancing in short rushes, while another held position and provided covering fire, then switching roles. This was the standard German fire and movement technique, refined through years of combat on the Eastern Front and in North Africa and Italy. These were not conscripts or poorly trained reserves. They moved with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who had done this many times before, who knew instinctively how to use terrain, how to minimize exposure, and how to maintain momentum under fire. Behind the infantry came the Tigers. Connor could see 4 of them clearly from his position, 60-ton vehicles moving through the thinner trees along the forest edge as though the timber offered no more resistance than tall grass. The Mark VI Tiger tank had entered service with the German Army in 1942 and remained one of the most formidable armored vehicles fielded by any nation during the war. Its frontal hull armor measured 100 millimeters in thickness, sufficient to deflect the standard American 75mm anti-tank round at most combat ranges. The 88mm KWK-36 main gun could penetrate the armor of any Allied tank in service at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The Tiger's operational weaknesses were its weight, its mechanical complexity, and the vulnerability of its tracks to damage from artillery and mines. None of those weaknesses mattered if the tanks reached the American foxholes intact. Connor reported his first fire mission. Enemy infantry in the open, approximately 600 meters distance, adjusting fire. The first salvo of 12 shells arrived 40 seconds after transmission, a pause that felt considerably longer when measured against the steady advance of 600 soldiers. The shells landed 150 yards behind the German formation, beyond the rear of the attacking line rather than within it. The Germans did not react. Artillery landing behind an advancing force was expected. It meant the defenders were guessing at distances, estimating rather than observing. The German infantry kept moving. Connor corrected immediately. He ordered the fire shifted 100 meters forward and called for effect. The second salvo arrived 18 seconds later. This time the shells landed directly among the advancing German formations. 12 105mm rounds, each carrying approximately 14 pounds of high explosive, detonated simultaneously across a concentrated area of forest occupied by soldiers moving in close formation. The lethal fragment radius of a single 105 mm shell extended approximately 50 yards in all directions. 12 shells overlapping across the same zone produced an effect that was not incremental but absolute. The German advance stopped. Soldiers who survived the initial impact ran for cover behind trees or dove into the craters the shells had just created. Connor called for sustained fire at the same coordinates, and the battery shifted to maximum rate of fire, 4 rounds per minute per gun, producing 48 shells per minute falling on the same section of forest. The German infantry broke apart as organized formations. Squad cohesion collapsed. Individual soldiers and small groups scrambled away from the impact zone in different directions. But the Tiger tanks had not stopped. They had broken clear of the tree line into open ground and were advancing in a wedge formation, 2 tanks forward, 2 behind, 2 covering the rear, with the methodical momentum of vehicles whose crews understood that American 105 mm artillery could not penetrate their armor. They were correct. The shells landing around them produced noise, concussion, and occasional track damage, but they could not kill a Tiger through direct impact on its hull. Connor shifted his fire mission to the tanks and began walking shells progressively closer to the advancing formation. 1 round landed 10 yards in front of the lead Tiger. The tank drove through the explosion without altering its speed. A subsequent round caught the lead Tiger's right track, breaking the track link and causing the vehicle to lurch hard right and stop. The tank was immobilized, but its 88 mm gun remained fully operational, and an immobilized Tiger with a working main gun was still capable of engaging American positions at range. 4 Tigers continued forward. Their commanders had now identified Connor's position. The telephone wire running across the snow was visible from the turrets, and the pattern of incoming American artillery made the observer's location unmistakable. The tanks adjusted their course toward the ditch. Connor looked at the ditch. 18 inches of frozen earth. Against an 88 mm armor-piercing round traveling at 900 meters per second, it was meaningless. Against the 7.92 mm MG-34 machine guns mounted in each Tiger's hull, it was barely adequate. The tanks were 150 yards away and closing. He lifted the handset and requested that the battery fire on his own position. The fire direction officer asked him to confirm the coordinates. Connor confirmed. The officer asked the second time. Connor confirmed again, and the officer accepted the mission. The first shells landed 30 yards in front of the ditch. The overpressure from the simultaneous detonations was physical. Connor felt the compression in his chest and lungs as though something had struck him without making contact. Frozen dirt and shrapnel flew overhead. He ordered the fire dropped another 20 yards. The next salvo landed 20 yards from the ditch rim. He could feel radiant heat from the nearest explosions on his face. Shrapnel was cutting through the air at a height of approximately 6 feet, precisely at head level for a standing man. The ditch kept him below it, but only just. If he had been 1 foot higher, he would have been killed by the fire he was directing. The Tigers halted. Their commanders closed the hatches and sealed the vehicles. Experienced tank crews operated with hatches open when possible, because closed hatches severely limited visibility and situational awareness. But artillery detonating within 30 yards of a vehicle forced even confident commanders to button up. The advance stopped while American shells continued to fall in the narrow corridor between Connor's ditch and the tank formation. The action continued for 2 hours and 15 minutes more. The German infantry attempted to reform on 3 separate occasions, using the bulk of the Tiger tanks as mobile cover, advancing behind the armor to stay out of the direct artillery impact zone. Connor adjusted fire each time, walking shells back along the German approach, targeting the spaces between the tanks where the infantry was moving. German counter-battery fire began landing around his position approximately 1 hour into the action. German observers had triangulated his location from the pattern of American fire corrections, and their own howitzers began methodically working toward the ditch from both sides. Connor called counter-battery fire against the German gun positions, and the incoming fire slackened, then stopped. 40 minutes into the action, a private from the battalion intelligence section crawled forward from the American foxholes, carrying additional wire and a backup handset. He positioned himself 5 feet to Connor's right and began calling out German movements on the flanks, angles Connor could not observe from his fixed position in the ditch. The private's contribution was immediate and practical. Approximately 40 minutes after his arrival, a shrapnel fragment tore through his left leg. Blood soaked into the snow around him. The private refused evacuation and remained in position for the duration of the action, his rifle ready, watching the approaches until the last German soldiers withdrew. The battalion commander came on the radio net and ordered Connor to fall back to the American line. The artillery would provide covering fire. Connor acknowledged the order and did not move. From his position in the ditch, he could see the entire German formation, could see every attempt to rally, every cluster of soldiers trying to reorganize for one more push. Withdrawing meant losing that observation. The artillery would revert to firing on estimated coordinates. The Germans would find the gap and use it. Connor stayed. 3 hours after he had walked out of the command post, the German counterattack was over. The surviving soldiers were pulling back through the shattered forest, moving slowly, dragging their wounded through the snow. Connor kept the battery firing as the Germans retreated, pursuing the withdrawal with shells to prevent any pause that might allow reorganization. When the fire direction officer reported that ammunition was nearly exhausted, and when Connor had watched the German force move far enough back into the tree line that a renewed assault was no longer possible, he stopped directing fire. He put down the handset. He tried to stand. His legs, locked in the same position for 3 hours against frozen earth at -10 degrees Celsius, barely held his weight. He steadied himself against the ditch wall and looked at the ground between his position and the German tree line. He looked at the 6 Tigers, 4 stopped in the field, 2 abandoned at the tree line. He looked at the cratered earth and the broken forest. Then he turned and helped the wounded private to his feet. They walked back toward the American line together. Connor and the private crossed the open ground slowly. The private's wounded leg would not bear his full weight, and Connor supported him with one arm, the two of them moving in the particular unsteady rhythm of men whose bodies had been pushed past their functional limits. The ground they crossed was almost unrecognizable from what it had been 3 hours earlier. The flat, snow-covered field that Connor had sprinted across at 7:15 that morning no longer existed. In its place was a landscape of overlapping craters, each one 2 to 3 feet deep, the excavated frozen earth piled in irregular rings around each impact point. The snow had been entirely stripped from approximately 200 yards of ground by the combined effect of American and German artillery, replaced by exposed frozen soil blackened with explosive residue, embedded with metal fragments of every size, from dust to fist-sized chunks of torn shell casing. Soldiers emerged from the forward foxholes as the two men approached. They had observed the entire action from their positions along the defensive line, had watched Connor drop into the ditch 30 yards ahead of them, had watched the German infantry advance and fall back and advance again across the ground between the ditch and the tree line. They had seen German counter-battery shells walk methodically toward the ditch and had watched American shells land close enough to the same position that the blast waves reached the foxholes. They had seen Connor remain in the ditch through all of it, through both barrages, through 3 hours of continuous artillery fire at distances that should not have left anyone alive. They stood at the edge of their positions as Connor and the private passed. No one spoke. No one cheered. In combat, men who have watched something extraordinary tend not to diminish it with noise. The battalion commander met Connor at the foxhole line. He was a man who had commanded soldiers in sustained combat since 1942, who had seen the full range of what men were capable of under extreme pressure. He looked at the battlefield behind Connor, at the cratered ground, the destroyed tigers standing motionless in the field, the shattered tree line, and then he looked at Connor. He did not say anything. He nodded once. Connor nodded back. Between men who had spent years in combat, that exchange was sufficient. Medics reached the wounded private immediately and moved him to the battalion aid station. The examination confirmed that the shrapnel wound to his left leg, while serious, had not struck bone or major blood vessels. The extreme cold had been a paradoxical asset. The low temperature had slowed the bleeding significantly during the hour and a half the private had remained in the ditch after being hit, reducing blood loss to a level that would not have been possible in warmer conditions. He was stabilized at the aid station and evacuated to a field hospital later that day. He would return to 3rd Battalion 6 weeks later, in early March 1945, before the end of the European War. Connor walked to the command post. His left shoulder had been numb for the better part of an hour, a detail he had registered during the action and filed away without acting on, because acting on it would have meant stopping. A medic examined the shoulder and located a small fragment of shrapnel embedded just beneath the skin. It had entered during the 3rd hour in the ditch, at a moment Connor could not precisely identify because by that point the action had produced a continuous series of impacts, concussions, and physical insults that had merged into a single sustained experience. The medic removed the fragment with a probe, dressed the wound, and recorded it in Connor's medical file. It was the 8th separate wound Connor had received since enlisting in March 1941. He did not request evacuation. He returned to his duties at the map table. The battalion intelligence section moved forward to the battlefield as soon as the German withdrawal was confirmed complete. Their task was systematic. Count the dead, document the destroyed equipment, record the locations of significant finds, and prepare the after-action report that would go up through regimental and divisional headquarters. They counted 53 German soldiers confirmed killed on the field, bodies that the withdrawing German force had been unable or had not attempted to remove. An additional 78 German soldiers were found wounded and unable to move, left behind when their unit pulled back. Both figures were considered minimum estimates. The German force had dragged additional casualties during the retreat. The blood trails leading back toward the tree line indicated that significant numbers of dead and wounded had been carried out. Total German casualties from the action were estimated at more than 150 killed and wounded, from a force that had numbered approximately 600 at the start of the operation. The 6 Tiger tanks were examined individually. 4 had been immobilized by artillery damage, track systems broken by near-direct hits, vision ports and optics shattered. In 2 cases, the engine deck damaged sufficiently to prevent operation. 2 had been abandoned intact by their crews after losing both drive tracks, the crews exiting under American fire and attempting to reach the tree line on foot. American technical intelligence teams arrived within hours of the German withdrawal to document and assess the vehicles. In January 1945, the Tiger tank remained one of the most formidable armored vehicles in service anywhere in the world, and every opportunity to examine captured or destroyed examples was treated as a high priority by Allied armor analysts. The vehicles would be stripped of usable intelligence before being cleared from the field. 3rd Battalion's own casualties for the action were 11 killed and 23 wounded. The distribution of those casualties across the timeline of the battle carried its own significance. The majority of American deaths and wounds had occurred during 2 specific periods: the German preparatory barrage between 700 and 712 before Connor had left the command post, and the initial Tiger advance between approximately 7:30 and 7:50, before Connor had been able to establish effective fire direction against the tanks. After Connor began directing the artillery battery from his position in the ditch, American casualties stopped entirely. The defensive line held without a single position being overrun. The German 19th Army did not attempt another offensive operation in the northern sector of the Colmar Pocket after January 24. The loss of 6 Tiger tanks was not a number the Army could absorb and replace in its operational situation. Armor assets in the pocket were limited. The logistical lines across the Rhine were under constant Allied air attack, and replacement vehicles were not available in the quantities required. More significantly, the loss of more than 150 experienced soldiers in a single failed assault further degraded the Army's already limited offensive capacity. The 19th Army shifted entirely to defensive operations and began preparing for the Allied attack that its commanders knew was imminent. The Colmar Pocket's final collapse came 3 weeks later. The French First Army, reinforced by American divisions, including elements of the 3rd Infantry Division, launched the operation to eliminate the pocket on February 2, 1945. The German defenses, weakened by weeks of attrition and the failure of the January offensives, gave way under sustained pressure. By February 9th, the last German units had been pushed across the Rhine. The pocket that had existed since November 1944 ceased to exist. France was entirely clear of German forces for the first time since June 1940. On February 10, 1945, Lieutenant General Alexander Patch made a journey that Army commanders rarely made. Patch was the commanding general of the United States 7th Army, a 3-star officer responsible for an entire Army's operations across a front of hundreds of miles. He traveled personally to 3rd Battalion's position to present Connor with the Distinguished Service Cross. The citation read at the ceremony described the action on January 24th in the measured language of official military documentation. The voluntary advance under direct artillery fire, the 3 hours directing the battery from an exposed position with no adequate cover, the decision to call fire onto his own coordinates when enemy forces had closed to within yards. It was the 2nd highest decoration the United States Army could award for valor in combat. The battalion commander had already submitted a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. The paperwork moved up through regimental headquarters to divisional level, then through Corps to Army. At each level, the recommendation was reviewed and supported. The action met the criteria in full. But the administrative process had a timeline of its own, and that timeline had collided with a different set of orders. Connor had been in continuous combat for 28 months. He had been wounded 8 times. The Army's rotation policy existed precisely to prevent the kind of sustained exposure Connor had accumulated, and the policy required that he be sent home. The Medal of Honor recommendation moved upward through the chain of command. Connor moved in the opposite direction, toward the coast, toward a transport ship, toward home. On March 15, 1945, Connor boarded a transport vessel at the port of Le Havre. The ship carried several hundred American soldiers, men rotating back to the United States after extended periods of combat service in the European theater. The Atlantic crossing took approximately 3 weeks. Connor arrived in New York Harbor in early April 1945, while the war in Europe still had 4 weeks remaining. He was 26 years old. He had left the United States as a 21-year-old tobacco farmer with no completed secondary education and returned as the holder of 4 Silver Stars, a Distinguished Service Cross, a Bronze Star, multiple Purple Hearts, and the French Croix de Guerre. He walked down the gangway in the same quiet manner he had always moved, without ceremony, without visible reaction, carrying what he carried internally and offering none of it to observation. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, with the unconditional surrender of German armed forces. Connor was already home, already in Kentucky, already trying to reconstruct the ordinary rhythms of a life that the previous 4 years had interrupted entirely. He was honorably discharged on June 22, 1945, at Fort Knox, Kentucky. The discharge paperwork recorded his service dates, his campaigns, his wounds, his decorations. It recorded 4 years and 3 months of service across North Africa, Italy, southern France, and Alsace. It did not and could not record what that service had cost him in ways that did not appear in medical reports or citation documents. Before his discharge, in May 1945, the town of Albany, Kentucky, held a public ceremony honoring its returning veterans. Connor attended as one of the most decorated soldiers the county had produced. His record had circulated through official channels and through the informal networks of families whose sons had served alongside him. Men who had written home about what they had witnessed, whose letters had been read aloud in living rooms across Clinton County. The ceremony's guest speaker was Sergeant Alvin York, the most celebrated American combat veteran of the First World War. York had been awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in the Argonne Forest in October 1918, during which he had killed 28 German soldiers and captured 132 others, largely acting alone. York had grown up in Pall Mall, Tennessee, 50 miles from Albany, in terrain and conditions nearly identical to those that had shaped Connor. York understood, in a way that most speakers at such ceremonies did not, what the citations read aloud actually described. It was at this ceremony that Connor met Pauline Wells. She was 20 years old, a young woman from Clinton County who had come to honor the returning soldiers and had stayed to listen as Connor's citations were read aloud. The language of military citations was formal and compressed. It reduced hours of sustained action under fire to sequences of declarative sentences. Pauline listened to the description of January 24, 1945, and found it genuinely difficult to reconcile what the words described with the quiet, lean man standing a few feet away from her who showed no particular awareness of his own distinction. Connor did not speak about his service at the ceremony. When people approached him with questions, and many did, he gave the same answer he would give for the rest of his life. He had done what needed to be done. They married on July 9, 1945, less than 2 months after the ceremony where they had met. They settled on a farm on Indian Creek, several miles north of Albany, on land that Connor knew from childhood. The farm had no electricity and no running water when they moved in. These were not unusual conditions for rural Clinton County in 1945. The electrification of rural Kentucky was still incomplete, and many farms in the county's more isolated areas operated without utility connections. Connor and Pauline worked the land with mules and horses, growing tobacco as the primary cash crop and corn for feed and subsistence. It was the same work Connor's family had done on the same land for generations, and Connor returned to it with the focused attention of a man who found in physical agricultural labor something that the previous 4 years had not provided. A relationship between effort and outcome that was direct, tangible, and entirely within his control. The medals went into a cardboard box. The box went inside a canvas military duffel bag. The duffel bag went into the back of the living room closet, behind other stored items, where it remained undisturbed. Pauline knew the box existed. She had seen its contents once: the Distinguished Service Cross in its case, the 4 silver stars, the Bronze Star, the Purple Hearts, the French Croix de Guerre awarded by the French government for Connor's service in the liberation of their country. Connor never removed the decorations from the closet. He never displayed them on a wall or in a case. He never wore them at public events where veterans commonly displayed their service records. When the subject of his wartime service arose in conversation, which happened occasionally, given that his record was not entirely unknown in the county, he redirected the discussion or ended it with the same formulation he always used. He had done what needed to be done. Other men had done the same. The men who had not come home deserved whatever recognition was available, not the ones who had. In 1950, the federal government exercised its authority under eminent domain to purchase the Connor Farm on Indian Creek. The construction of Wolf Creek Dam across the Cumberland River, approximately 30 miles to the northeast, was creating a reservoir that would eventually cover 91 miles of river valley, a project that displaced dozens of families across several counties. The flooding of Indian Creek was collateral to the dam's primary purpose of flood control and hydroelectric generation, but it was absolute. The farm Connor had returned to in 1945 would cease to exist as farmland. The Connors moved to the Roland community in the southeastern portion of Clinton County and began again on new land, with the same crops, the same methods, and without significant discussion of what the displacement meant to them personally. Connor became president of the Clinton County Farm Bureau in the mid-1950s and held the position for 17 years. The Farm Bureau was the primary institutional advocate for agricultural interests in the county, and the role required the particular combination of practical knowledge and organizational patience that Connor had developed across decades of farming difficult Kentucky land. He advised other farmers on crop rotation schedules, on soil conservation techniques appropriate to the region's terrain, and on navigating the federal agricultural support programs that had become an essential part of farm economics in the post-war period. He was effective in the role not because he sought influence, but because he understood the problems other farmers faced from direct personal experience. His work in veterans organizations was conducted in the same manner, practical, consistent, and without self-promotion. He traveled to neighboring counties regularly to assist veterans in filing benefit claims with the Veterans Administration. The VA claims process in the post-war decades was complex, paper-intensive, and frequently frustrating for men who had difficulty articulating medical conditions in the bureaucratic language the agency required. Connor navigated the process on behalf of others, drawing on his own experience with the system and his capacity for methodical administrative work. He did this without compensation and without publicity. It was simply another problem that required someone to address it. The decades accumulated. Connor and Pauline raised their family on the Roland farm. He aged into the community role of a man known for steady reliability, as Farm Bureau president, as veterans advocate, as a neighbor who could be counted on for practical assistance without drama. His health began to decline in the late 1980s. Diabetes, then kidney disease. The physical strength that had carried him through 4 amphibious landings and 8 wounds diminished in the ordinary way of aging men, gradually and without the particular drama of combat. The cardboard box remained in the closet. The medals remained in the box. January 24, 1945, remained where Connor had placed it when he stepped off the transport ship in New York Harbor, across the Atlantic Ocean, in a country he had left behind, in a ditch near a village in Alsace that most Americans could not have located on a map. By 1996, Connor was 77 years old. His kidneys were failing. His doctors measured his remaining time in months, or, at most, a year or two. He had told no journalist, no historian, no documentary filmmaker what had happened near Houston on January 24, 1945. He had told his wife the minimum. He had told his children nothing. For 51 years, the action that a battalion commander had recommended for the Medal of Honor had existed in military archives and in the fading memories of aging veterans, and nowhere else that mattered. Then, on an ordinary day in 1996, a letter arrived at the Roland farmhouse. The letter that arrived at the Roland farmhouse in 1996 was handwritten, several pages long, and came from a man named Richard Chilton. Chilton was not a historian, not a journalist, not a government official. He was a civilian conducting personal research into the military service of his uncle, Private Gordon Roberts, who had been killed during the Anzio campaign in January 1944. Chilton had spent considerable time tracing his uncle's unit assignments through the National Archives and through the Army's record system, and those records had led him to Connor, an officer who had served alongside Roberts during the months preceding Roberts' death, and who appeared in several documents connected to his uncle's unit. Chilton wrote to ask a simple question. Did Connor remember anything about his uncle's final days? Connor read the letter and invited Chilton to visit. They met in the living room of the Roland farmhouse, a room that contained nothing on its walls that indicated who Connor had been between 1941 and 1945. Connor was 77 years old. He was visibly ill, thin in the way that serious kidney disease produces, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned to conserve energy because his body no longer generated it reliably. He sat across from Chilton and talked about Anzio. He described the conditions of the campaign in January and February 1944, the freezing mud of the beachhead, the German artillery that fired on the Allied positions around the clock, the compressed geography of the perimeter that meant there was no place on the beachhead beyond the range of German guns. He described Roberts. He described finding Roberts after Roberts had been hit, carrying him to the nearest medical aid station, and staying with him until he died. 52 years had passed since those events. As Connor spoke, he began to cry. He did not attempt to stop or conceal it. The memory had not faded or softened with time. It had simply been stored in a place where he did not go except under specific conditions, and Chilton's questions had opened it. This was the man who had spent 3 hours in a frozen ditch directing artillery fire against 6 Tiger tanks without visible distress, who had returned to his duties immediately after being wounded for the 8th time, who had placed his medals in a box and put the box in a closet without ceremony. The soldier who had not broken under any physical pressure the war had applied to him sat in his living room 50 years later and wept for a private he had carried to an aid station and could not save. Pauline, who had been present throughout the conversation, suggested that Chilton examine Connor's military records. The records were detailed, she said, and might contain information about Robert's unit assignments that would be useful for Chilton's research. She went to the closet and retrieved the canvas duffel bag, and from it the cardboard box. She placed the box on the table between Connor and Chilton and opened it. Chilton had some familiarity with military decorations from his research into his uncle's service. He understood the structure of the American award system, what each decoration represented, what standards of evidence were required to award it. He examined the contents of the box methodically: the Distinguished Service Cross in its presentation case, the 4 silver stars, the Bronze Star, the Purple Hearts, the French Croix de Guerre. Then he read the citations. He read each one carefully, including the citation for the Distinguished Service Cross describing the action on January 24, 1945. His hands began shaking before he finished the first page. He set the papers down. He looked at Connor. He looked at Pauline. Then he said, with complete directness, that the man sitting across from him should have received the Medal of Honor. Chilton was not making a casual observation. The Medal of Honor criteria were specific. The act must involve conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty, in direct combat against an opposing armed force. The citation he had just read described a staff officer who had voluntarily advanced 400 yards under direct artillery fire, established a forward observation post 30 yards ahead of the medal. American defensive line directed artillery fire for 3 continuous hours from a position that provided no meaningful protection, called fire onto his own coordinates on multiple occasions when enemy forces closed to within yards of his position, refused a direct order to withdraw, and remained in position until the attacking force had been completely repelled. The Distinguished Service Cross was not a minor decoration. It was the 2nd highest award the Army could give. But what the citation described was an action for which the Medal of Honor existed. Chilton began the formal process immediately after returning home. He filed a request for upgrade with the Army Board for Correction of Military Records, the administrative body responsible for reviewing and correcting errors or injustices in military personnel records. He assembled sworn eyewitness statements from veterans who had been in the forward foxholes on January 24th and had observed the action directly. He constructed a documented evidentiary case and submitted it through the proper channels. The Army Board reviewed the application and rejected it in 1997. Chilton filed a formal appeal. The appeal was rejected in 2000. Connor died on November 5, 1998, between the initial rejection and the appeal. He was 79 years old. The cause of death was kidney failure. the disease that had been diminishing him since the late 1980s. He was buried at Memorial Hill Cemetery in Albany, Kentucky. The Distinguished Service Cross, the decoration he had carried in a cardboard box in the back of a closet for 53 years, was buried with him. He died as he had lived since March 1945, without the Medal of Honor, without having made any personal effort to obtain it, and without apparent awareness that its absence represented an institutional failure rather than an accurate assessment of what he had done. Pauline Connor did not stop. She was in her 70s, a woman who had spent 50 years married to a man who refused to discuss the most significant days of his life, and she understood with complete clarity what the cardboard box contained and what the Army's repeated rejections meant. She located 3 additional veterans who had served in 3rd Battalion's forward foxholes on January 24, 1945, men who had watched the entire action from a distance of 30 yards, and obtained their sworn statements. She resubmitted the case to the Army Board in 2008. The board did not respond substantively. The application entered the institutional limbo that bureaucratic processes create for cases that do not fit neatly into current procedures. The case attracted external support over the following years. Military historians examined the documentary record and reached consistent conclusions. The Rhode Island State Senate passed a formal resolution in 2005 specifically calling for the Medal of Honor upgrade, a legislative gesture without binding force but with symbolic weight. 7 retired general officers reviewed the evidence and submitted written endorsements of the upgrade. The accumulated institutional support was substantial and produced no result. In 2014, Pauline filed suit against the United States Army in federal district court. She was 85 years old. The legal argument was that the Army's failure to act on a clearly documented injustice was itself a violation of the obligation to maintain accurate and fair military records. The district court judge ruled against her on procedural grounds. The statute of limitations for challenging a military records decision had expired. She appealed the ruling to the 6th Circuit Court of Appeals. The 6th Circuit did not dismiss the appeal outright and instead directed the case to mediation. During the mediation proceedings, something happened that no procedural framework had anticipated. The government attorney assigned to represent the Army's position, a federal lawyer whose professional obligation was to defend the Army's procedural stance, broke down and wept during the session. She explained to the mediator that her father had served in 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment. He had been wounded on January 25, 1945, one day after Connor's action on the same section of front line. She had spent weeks preparing the government's case and had read every document in the file. She told the mediator directly that the man whose medal application she had been assigned to oppose may have saved her father's life. The Army Board for Correction of Military Records recommended the upgrade formally in 2015. Congress passed legislation waiving the statutory time limit that had blocked the award through legal channels. On March 29, 2018, the White House announced that the Medal of Honor would be presented. On June 26, 2018, in a formal ceremony in the East Room of the White House, the Medal of Honor was presented to Pauline Connor. She was 89 years old. Her husband had been dead for 20 years. The citation was read aloud in full before the assembled guests. It described, in the official language of military commendation, what First Lieutenant Garland Merl Connor had done on January 24, 1945, near the village of Husson in Alsace, France. The same facts that had been recorded in the Distinguished Service Cross citation 73 years earlier, the advance under fire, the exposed position, the 3 hours of fire direction, the calls onto his own coordinates, were read aloud now in the room where American presidents received foreign heads of state. Pauline held the medal in both hands. She had been 20 years old when she first heard Connor's citation read aloud at a ceremony in Albany, Kentucky, in May 1945, and had found it difficult to reconcile the description with the quiet man standing in front of her. She was 89 years old now, and the medal she was holding was the one that the battalion commander had recommended in January 1945, that the paperwork had pursued through every level of the chain of command, and that had never arrived. 22 years had passed since Richard Chilton opened the cardboard box in the Rowland farmhouse. Garland Connor had been dead for 2 decades. He had grown up 15 miles from the nearest school on a Kentucky tobacco farm. He had never completed his education. He had enlisted 9 months before his country entered the war and had served until the Army sent him home. He had done what he believed needed to be done on 10 major campaigns across 4 countries, and had then returned to farming and told no one. The ditch near Hausen, where he spent 3 hours on January 24, 1945, still exists today. It is 18 inches deep. It runs through a field that has been productive farmland again for decades. There is no marker. There is no sign. There is nothing to indicate what happened there, or who lay in it, or what that one man prevented. Garland Connor would have preferred it exactly that way. This was the story of Garland Merl Connor, a man who did what needed to be done, put his medals in a box, and went back to farming. The historical record is precise. 1 man, 1 telephone, 400 yards of wire, and 3 hours that held a battalion's line intact. We will continue telling stories like this one, documented, accurate, and largely forgotten by everyone except the men who were there. If this video was useful to you, subscribe to the channel. It is the most direct way to make sure these stories reach the people who should hear them. Thank you for watching.